What do you hold on to fiercely when it seems that the world around us is changing or uncertain or at times falling apart and confusing? We are not the first people to ask this question. This week on my mind is a man who determined that at the invisible level, life itself is uncertain. A physicist by the name of Werner Heisenberg. He won the Nobel Prize in the 1930s for determining that you could never quite know where the smallest particles of matter were. It's called the uncertainty principle. It's the idea that the smaller you get, the more invisible the reality, the less we can possibly know about what's happening in the world. He invented what's called quantum mechanics, and as scientific and difficult to understand as it might be for some of us, what he determined was that the invisible reality of the world was chaos, uncertainty at the most mysterious basic levels. And in 1937, his world in Germany was uncertain as it was for so many. He watched the Nazi powers coming into their being and getting power in his country. He watched the political systems unraveling in a world which looked like itself would unravel on the precipice of war. And so this man who knew that while tanks and guns, politics were changing, while the world around him seemed dangerous and fragile, the man who knew that on the invisible level life was uncertain too, fell in love and found his solid ground right there in a person named Elizabeth. He was a lover of music. And one night, while people were playing violin and piano, he saw a woman who he fell in love with immediately, heard her voice and saw her face. They talked about Beethoven. And 3 weeks later, they were engaged, and 3 months later, married. In the midst of a world that felt like it was unraveling, they wrote these love letters to each other in which they said, "You are my solid ground. Loving you gives me stability and comfort and peace." They wrote letters about waiting to spend the rest of their lives together by a cabin, by a lake, in the woods. What it would mean to raise a family, to bring more love into the world. That's exactly what they did. Even in the midst of a chaotic world around them, that's exactly what they did, even though the world was at war. And while he himself was working on nuclear weapons for the Germans, which they never materialized, some people believe that he sabotaged that effort, because later in his life he worked against those weapons for decades. What is possible to know is that the man who discovered that at the invisible level life is chaotic and mysterious and uncertain and we can never precisely know what's going to happen, when his world seemed to be unraveling, the love of a tangible human being was solid ground. This week I found my solid ground in 2 boys, my sons. In the break in the rain here in Dallas, in the brief periods that we had, I took advantage of taking these 2 young children with me out for a walk. Something that feels like an everyday thing, but in this week felt very precious. We walked in residential neighborhoods and stopped, and all of a sudden, little things became very important to us. My children would stop and look at the reflection of the sun in a puddle and measure with sticks in their hands how deep the water was. I watched my youngest child take little pill bugs that he called his friends and carefully place them into a large acorn and hold them in safety in his hands as if he were the only thing that could protect them. I watched them pull dandelions out of people's yards as if they were roses or the most precious flowers and plants you could possibly find. I watched them marvel at the places where a leaf had fallen into the concrete and made a mark like a fossil. In the midst of being cooped up in a house and not going outside, with the rains outside in this break, little things like a picked flower or a small insect, an acorn in your hand or the mark of a leaf felt precious and holy, and they were. found myself recognizing that in this uncertain moment and these uncertain times, these little things mattered so much. And yet also on that walk, fragility and mortality were all around us and very much on my mind. The flowers that we picked were wilted and dead by the time we got back home. I wondered what it was like for these small insects held in the hands of a child to be carried up, their world upended by a large and sometimes not so gentle creature. I wondered how long these small creatures would live. I reminded myself during this period of Lent that no matter how long my children or I or the people that I loved will live, it will not be long, that life is precious and fragile no matter what. It's Lent time during the church, time when we're reflecting on what it means to be a human, why it can often be so hard to be a person, what it means to know as creatures that we live and that we have to die, and that fragility, that mortality seems so at the front of our minds right now. We're not at the precipice of a world war like Heisenberg or others were, but the world does feel like it's changing and uncertain and moving so quickly every day. We're called to adapt to it. And in that time, like on the walk with my children, everyday little things have taken these special, important meanings. I find that getting up and brushing my teeth in front of the mirror feels like a sacrament. The simple pleasure of a good cup of coffee or fried egg in the morning, the warmth of the sun when you get to go outside. Conversation with a good friend or family member over the phone. Seeing the face of someone I love or holding a child against my bones. These things which are everyday small moments all of a sudden feel even more precious, like holy, sacred gifts. All of a sudden little things like going to the grocery store, finding a way to work, determining whether or not we can see and hold the people that we love, these things that we took for granted and never should have are highlighted in our vision. And the human implications are vast. All of a sudden we're wondering who we can hold and touch. All of a sudden, people who give birth to a baby don't know if their family members can come and celebrate that new life being born into the world. All of a sudden, little things like a sneeze or a cough feel like anxiety-provoking moments. All of a sudden, we're finding it hard to grieve in one another's presence. When one among us dies or someone is sick, we can't go into the room or care or be together, and the human impact on this distance is felt by so many of us, I know. In that poem that Reverend Cantor read in our service this morning by Ellen Bass, If You Knew, she asks us, so many years ago when she wrote the poem, what if you knew you would be the last person to touch someone? If when you took the ticket from someone at the movies or the person who handed you your groceries or took your money, if you knew that you were the last person to touch them, what would it be like? Would you hold their hands for just a moment longer? Would you look at the lines in their hands? Would you show them care? Her reminder, what she is trying to communicate to us in the poem, is that life is fragile. That you never know what's going to happen or whether the person in front of you is going to live decades or minutes. And so she calls for a kind of tenderness and grace for one another and ourselves. She says, what would it look like to see people as they are? Soaked in honey, stung and swollen, reckless and pinned against time. In her poem, she's trying to remind us of something that has always been true. It might feel a little truer today, where we don't touch the hand of the person taking our ticket and don't have a ticket at all. where we're at a distance from the people taking our groceries or money and even the people that we love? What would it look like if you knew you were the last to touch someone is a funny question to ask when we're not supposed to be touching anybody. But her reminder of the fragility of life is as true as it's ever been. But this isn't new. It's not new to be fragile. It's not new to be mortal. It's not new to know that all of us can be sick, that all of us can be stung and swollen, that all of us will one day lay our bodies back into the earth. That is not new. That is part of the deal for being alive. It's part of the equation for being made up of matter. Being in a physical body, being at all, means risking being stung and swollen and cut and bruised or hurt. It means risking being lonely and knowing that we have to die, but knowing that while we are alive, we get to be soaked in honey too. We get to love and be loved. We get to have good meals and precious friends. We get to watch the sunrise and collect insects in our hands and carry them like the most precious cargo. We get to pick dandelions as if they were roses. But being in a body means the risk of knowing that that body is fragile. In Christian language, it's talked about as God being incarnate. Incarnation in the world. And the idea of the Christian teachings was that God came into the world in the person of Jesus. A teacher who grew up in a real human body as an infant and a child, who knew what it was like to be hungry or lonely or afraid. That it didn't make sense to talk about God unless you were talking about what it meant to live in a human life as well. What it meant to feel hot sun or sand against your skin, what it means to get cut or bruised. In the Christian teachings, this person, supposedly God on earth, and at the very least a miraculous teacher, says that to be in proximity with those who suffer in their bodies is real. To be in the presence of those who are sick and care for them is what God looks like. To care about the hunger of a human body or the loneliness of a human heart, that it's not ideas, it's tangible love for tangible humans in real bodies, incarnate right here and right now. And at least in the Christian story, God itself becomes at risk. God takes on a human body that can be bruised and even die. For us, the fact that we can be stung and swollen, that we can be sick, that we can one day die, doesn't remove the holy from our lives. It is all around us in those very tangible moments too. That very same flower that will wilt by the time you get home is alive with God. The warmth of the sun is evidence of the holy in our lives, the mark of that leaf in the concrete, the hand that holds you, the hand you can hold. All of those little tangible moments that will fade just like us. Each one precious and holy and evidence of a reality that has existed long before us. It is part of the deal of being alive, to be fragile and finite. And it's the only way we ever feel the warmth of the sun on our skin. Being fragile and finite means that it's the only way that we ever know what it feels like to be held by someone we love, to hear the words, "I love you," and to know where our solid ground is. It is true that the world feels uncertain right now, and to many of us unraveling fast. And so what we are called to do is what we have always been called to do. To know where our solid ground is and to hold fast to it. In the 1930s, for a physicist who knew that at the invisible level life was uncertain, his solid ground was the love of a person. Building a life. Saying "I love you" and having children and having a home in a cabin by the lake and listening to music, his solid ground was knowing he was loved. For so many of us, our solid ground is a God who will never leave us, who moves the stars and the sun, who forces us like gravity toward one another, even when we can't touch, and who will not let us go and never has. For so many of us, our solid ground will be other people in our lives. Two little boys picking flowers in yards and staring at puddles, or a person that stares you in the eyes and says, "I love you." But in uncertain times, we are called, as we've always been, to find where solid ground is and stand there firmly. And in uncertain times, we are called, as we always have been, to savor this world and make everyday moments sacraments. Those little things that take on great importance. The feeling of a small hand holding mine, or the comfort of a good cup of coffee or breakfast, the pleasure of going outside and feeling the sun, a good piece of music. Our job in this moment is also to savor this world, to pay deep attention to every beautiful moment that we have and to make it a sacrament, to pause and taste our food, to feel the warmth of the sun on our skin, to look at those we love and to hold the people we can hold tightly, and to know that that moment is evidence of the holy right against our flesh. This is an uncertain moment, but they have always been uncertain. And we are reminded of our mortality, and we have always been mortal, and we are fragile now, and we have always been fragile. That is part of the deal. And yet, in the midst of it all, there is solid ground. There is love. There is compassion. There is a God that has not and will not let us go. There is someone who loves you deeply. And every moment, if we pause and recognize it, can be evidence of that God and that holy mystery moving in us, around us, with us, and through us. This week and all weeks, be well, be safe, and pause to feel the sun on your skin and make it holy. This day is as precious as any has ever been. May it be so. Amen.